Well, hello everyone. Happy Monday, happy July. Um, Thank you so much for taking time out of your summer to join on tonight. I really appreciate it. Mary, I got your email today, just detailing so many great ideas and different things, some of it which we've touched on, some of it which we haven't. And I really appreciate that. I know a number of people, just because it's summertime, have a hard time jumping on, but so people have sent me emails over similar to Mary's, which I do appreciate just everyone's engagement, either joining on here or just with me individually. So first, let me thank everyone for that. Um, I have a little agenda up here, but I think you guys have the kind of vibe of what I go off of. It's a small group, so I like to keep it really casual, let the conversation go as it may. But there's a couple things I just wanted to touch on, review with you guys. And I have an agenda here, but we rarely stick to the agenda line by line. But as I said previously, I do love a good PowerPoint. So just to help me remember what I want to go over today. Similar spiel, small groups all this week. Be respectful of everyone's opinions. Everyone's been so great with that so far, so I don't really think I have to remember. But remember, everyone's here is for the right reason, for the same reason, even though we might have different opinions. On the email I sent you guys out reminding you of this meeting, there's links to all the share drives. So you can access your share drive or another group share drive to see what information they put in here. You'll find links to different information, all that same old spiel. There's some more documents in ours. The summary pages also got emailed out. They're also on their website. They're also in the share drive. So you guys have access to all the videos, all the summaries, everything like that. So one of the things I wanted to talk about today, we could talk about it now, we could talk about it towards the end of the meeting, but one of the things I'm sending out probably in the next couple weeks is a survey to you guys. One, there's my main purpose of the survey to begin with was to improve on working groups like this. I said this in the beginning, this is the first time we've done something like this. We'd like to continue doing it. But we want to improve it. And so I just want, hopefully positive feedback. It's my first time doing a big group like this. So but just instructive like criticism of how we can improve this group going forward. And the second thing I really wanted to discuss with you guys was I was thinking this was brought up in a number of groups of having surveys go out. And I know different organizations have done surveys regarding funding and budget for education. But I was also thinking about creating a survey for you guys to push out to your community. So a survey that's based on some of the things that we've discussed in our group, some of the focus, just to get more feedback from members within the group, but also hoping that you guys can email the survey out just to get feedback of what are the top priorities for you in this. And how I was going to base the survey again was off discussion points in our groups. That being said, I also want input from you guys of what information you think in a survey form I should gather from you, but also what do you think would be beneficial if you're going to send a survey out and gather information from your crew of people, what questions should we gather and what information should we gather that's going to be most beneficial to the legislature or different parties looking at education reform. So that's something to keep in the back of your mind as we discuss today. It's not something you have to give me feedback on in this moment. So just think about it throughout the week because I really want your guys' input and to make the survey the most beneficial. And again, to improve upon surveys going forward too. Every time I take a survey, I'm like, oh, I wish they asked this. So that's what I'm trying to get from now. And then, of course, after we do this survey, we can always review the survey and see what we can do better next time. The other thing I wanted to touch on just for housekeeping things is how the white paper is going to come about. Again, there's two main purposes, just like the survey for the white paper. One is to demonstrate everything that we talked about here. So all the priorities and concerns of the greater community. So the whole purpose of this group was not just to talk to the same old crew that we always talk to make sure we talk to people outside of the normal representatives. So my biggest thing with the white paper is just to express what your guys' beliefs and ideas and everything are. And then the second main thing is to start and continue the long-term conversations. Something I've mentioned in meetings before is that there's so many ideas we're talking about. It's really hard to get them all done in one shot, right? So I see this as a continuation of discussions that have been ongoing for years. And just another thing to facilitate the ongoing discussion, to keep these ideas alive, to keep them discussed. whether the legislature's in session, whether, you know, we're doing a 10-year review or not, to keep this conversation going, because that's how policy changes really get made, I think, is in the long term. So those are the two main purposes that I'm going to try to do with this white paper. And like I've said, I'm trying to be an impartial arbiter of you, just distilling what you guys are telling me, combining it with the other groups, and then passing that on to the legislature. So I will bring up, so obviously there's the May survey. I won't put on the May survey, May summary. But I also have the June summary. So the June summary, I put a narrative in here too, because I will also be putting a narrative within the white papers for narratives for the different discussions. I could put this up here just as a discussion point for us, but it'd be good to just review the two kind of summary documents when you guys have time over the coming weeks, to see if there's anything like I really miss. Obviously, this is a summary, but based on the video and the summary, am I hitting the main topics that you guys are looking to express to the legislature? Obviously, knowing there's a lot more detail behind these things, and I've collected a lot of information from you guys. A lot of people have provided different studies or stats, if they've worked with organizations. So all of those studies and stats and everything that are in the shared drive or other resources will be built into the white paper. But the biggest thing for me, and why I did these summaries for you guys to review, is to make sure that I'm not missing anything huge. And I know, Mary, there's some things you hit on that are not in here. That's good, because you sent them to me in a hard copy, so I have them. So that's kind of, I guess, where we stand now. So those are the housekeeping items. So I'll make my screen bigger. Yes, so I can zoom. The narrative's not quite as important right now as these discussion points. We can use this as the basis, but I don't want to put Mary on the spot too much. And Mary, I'm happy to bring up some of the things you talked about. I would love for you to highlight some of the things you sent in an email over to me today. So guys, Mary sent like a really detailed, cool email with a lot of interesting ideas. So I'd love for you to start off by talking about some of them.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I guess, Katie, you may know some. I mean, you obviously know what's been brought up and what hasn't. So it might be good for you to highlight those, but just for everybody's background, I had done some reading and research with all the links that Katie had put up, as well as a couple of searches on my own for things, and then put together a list of priorities, which I had 11 of them. So,
well, some of the things like you talked about, just comparing, I'll talk about the number one issue in all the groups, I would say, is teacher retention, teacher salary. It's brought up in every single group. So you brought up that, just comparing salaries and bringing, one of the things she mentioned is to meet the minimum living wage, salaries need to be 62,000. Average teacher salary in Montana is 55,000. So she highlighted that, bringing in some stats, although you did say check your math. I have not checked your math yet.
okay, yeah.
I'll put a disclaimer. You also brought up some of the infrastructure and the issues with passing local levies. We can expand upon that a little bit more too. I know some people have looked at Wyoming and they're like, oh, Wyoming has a separate building fund that's funded by the state. They fund it mostly through oil tax revenue. And then school districts actually apply to the state for their building project, and then the state approves the projects and it's funded directly from the state. So that's something that other groups brought up, possibly in this group too. They combined in my head. Mary, also you brought up different salary table for special education teachers. And we've talked about the different salary levels, but we haven't talked about too much of like doing a further separation, or further extra funding for certain specialized teachers. That's something we haven't dug too far into. I don't know if you want to expand on your thoughts regarding that.
Yeah, I guess I was just some of the reading that I was doing was explaining the the additional education and or specialized education that special ed teachers get, and the fact that their jobs are challenging. I mean, every teacher's job is challenging for sure, but that there are special challenges for that population, and that retaining teachers in that might, offering a different salary schedule might help with that.
I do know, well, I guess 2 points is something we talked about in the last group was special education teachers do have the highest turnover rate of teachers. So their specialty does have a higher turnover rate. Special ed teachers do get paid more, but there's definitely ways that we could look at different incentives or increased money or whatever it may be. There's definitely different ways to look at that. Another interesting thing that I'll pull out from Mary saying, and this one I know for a fact has not been discussed in any group, was, so you mentioned this on federal lands, but just in general, you're talking about how taxpayers don't have a great understanding of where their taxpayer dollars go, where their fees go. And she mentioned like putting like, if it's a fee when you go into a park or something, actually posting a sign or clearly identifying where those funds go. I thought that was an interesting idea. One thing is like, yes, oh, here's a hard sign, but are there other ways like the state government can disclose like where that tax revenue that they're collecting, fees, whatever it may be, is there different ways that they can publicly disclose that information so people are more knowledgeable in their day-to-day lives? I thought that was something really interesting to dig into more. Some things I don't know how they would necessarily like advertise that. But I would love to talk about that more, because just education on the budget process was something also brought up in a lot of groups.
Yeah, and I started thinking about after I sent the email that sometimes there are, when they're doing road construction work on state highways, they have a sign saying your tax dollars at work, kind of thing. And it seems to me there's this, and I think one of the things I talked about was the lack of support for school levies, particularly, at least I'm most knowledgeable about in Flathead County, and that that people don't really understand where that, a school may put out a levy and say this is what we need it for, but when they get it, they don't, which is rare, but you don't see signs or some kind of thanking the community for the tax dollars that go to support, whether it's programs or increasing addressing life, health, safety issues in school buildings. So that was, it kind of came to me that maybe, following the example of public lands where they talk about where those fee dollars are being spent and actually put a sign up when a building is, or whatever it is that's going to be, that where fee dollars were spent on, that recognizes that. So might help with educating everybody about where their tax money goes.
And I think that's something, I think some of the things we've discussed maybe are not necessarily like a legislative fix. I don't want that to scare us off from including it in the white paper or having a discussion, because I do think the community engagement and community education piece is an important piece. I think something there, a lot of people have brought up that there seems to be sometimes a disconnect between the educators and the community that they're serving. And I think some of that causes some of the issues we're seeing with the levies or whatever. So there's ways I think we can flush that out further. And I think a lot of the discussion in these different groups are very good for that, because it's bringing different people in the community together to say, identify that this is a problem. Whether like one group said, and she's a parent, and she was like, sometimes parents don't feel welcome in the school. and then the teachers feel attacked, but it's really just a disconnect. And I think that all ties together. I'm not exactly sure how all of this will be solved, but I think the education of the budget, the failure of the levies, the disconnect, I think it all ties together, and it's something that we as a community will need to address. Again, whether that be legislatively, I don't know. It's hard to address emotions like that legislatively, but we think that's something that could be beneficial that comes out of this group. That's not a white paper, that's not a legislative fix, that we take it on as a community.
I guess the other thing I brought up, Katie, it was kind of the last one was, and I had read somewhere that other schools, and I'm not sure that it was in Montana, but other schools in other states were setting up 501c3 where they could get donations, and then taxpayers were offered a dollar for dollar tax credit for making that donation. And I know that I was trying to think of some ways to kind of offset the costs of asking for more state money for education, which is the bottom line. But that big, there's pretty big salary difference particularly for teachers at the starting level versus what the cost of living is. And so it's, I was trying to find ways to address that. And I didn't know too much. I guess one more thing was about the thought that our federal representatives in Congress and the Senate can ask for more money for state education. Is that, and it seems like I read that somewhere that that was an option.
Very appropriate for this group, but one of the things we discussed was the federal government, and obviously I'm summarizing it. For special education, a lot of the requirements for special education come from the federal government, from IDEA. They can fund up to 40% of the costs, and right now they usually fund in the teens. I think the closest they got was 19 or 20% a few years ago. So that was something, and that is something we're going to include too. So something we can discuss is, one, requests to pass on federally. And the other thing is there is the 10-year budget cycle. So these are smaller things you can request. It's just like, hey, put pressure on the federal government to fully fund IDEA. Also, these are some things we would like for you to specifically look at in the 10-year study. So there's a couple things that some groups have, and Tamara, I'm looking at you. One of the things we're including is a better analysis of unfunded and underfunded mandates. So that obviously ties in, why I brought it up, ties into the IDEA funding, and it ties into special education funding and the gifted and talented program, what Tamara's on here advocating for. So we could think along those lines too.
Probably others too.
Oh, yes.
And probably others, yes.
Well, that's something I think why we want to direct them or ask them to direct in a 10-year study is a better analysis and identification of those unfunded mandates, which sometimes those are easier to pick out than the underfunded ones, like the IDEA. That one's obviously out there. We talk a lot about, but I'm sure there's other things out there that are not coming to our mind that are requirements that are underfunded for the cost that it needs to meet those requirements. So if there's other ideas along those lines too that we want to ask for the 10-year analysis to include, keep that in the back of your mind as well.
I think this 501c3, having the ability for a school district to have a 501c3 tagged with it for people to be able to donate specifically, like, a person might know that their tax dollars are going to the school, but maybe they're an artist and they want to provide extra support for the arts. Then they could donate money specifically to tag to, like, here's an extra $250 that I want to go specifically to the arts in my local schools. And if that's a way to help that happen, my recent experience in my district shows that people are willing to donate to a specific aspect of the schooling that they want to support, outside of like the sports boosters clubs that already exist. And I think there's an avenue for that that hasn't been tapped for things beyond sports.
Great, and I believe like the current tax incentive program that's set up has certain restraints that restrict the school's ability to spend some of that dollars, has to be spent in certain ways. So I think what we've talked about in other groups is expanding that the current tax credit program, or looking for ways to make it easier for schools to utilize. And there's also a cap, and I know the cap is hit pretty quickly each cycle. So that's something I think that a lot of the groups were interested in, looking and expanding that, and finding different ways to leverage the resources in the community in a donation and volunteer capacity, and make that accessibility easier, I think makes a lot of sense.
And Katie, I assume other groups brought this up, but the inflation cap at 3% seems ripe for updating.
Yeah. Something else that was brought up in the other groups, it was also discussed during the committee hearings a few weeks back, kind of a backfill. So using some of the surplus money that is available now as a backfill to accommodate for some of the inflationary pressures that weren't addressed in the past few years with that 3% kind of, it's a cap that the legislature can change. So it's not like a firm, like crazy, like you don't have to have a vote on it. Well, legislature, but you don't have it's not in the Constitution or anything like that. That's so they can lift the cap or change the cap or decide whatever inflationary number they want to go forward with. But that was something discussed, and it seemed like the legislature was open to it. So I know that's kind of a patch, not a long-term fix, but it seemed like something people were excited about. And I see you guys shaking your heads. So that means like, yeah, that sounds like at least a stopgap. Shelby, I'm going to put you on the spot because I've seen you shake your head a couple times, but I was wondering if there's anything that's on your mind. Obviously, if something we hit or something that we haven't hit yet.
No, I've been listening to so many of these discussions. So like you, I'm like, oh, I can't remember what group it was in that talked about it, but thanks for actually all the work you've done in posting everything. It's been really fun to go listen to all of the meetings, even the ones we haven't been part of. So I was just thinking about what Mary said about being on different salary schedules, because I know there are a few, I'm a speech pathologist, and I'm the president of the state association for speech pathology and audiology. And so I know that Great Falls Public Schools and Hamilton both have a separate schedule for their medically related professionals. So that's OT, PT, speech, and nurses. But I think that, you know, looking at putting special ed onto something like that, or creating a separate matrix. I mean, again, we come up against number one, how much harder is our job versus every teacher right now. So that's a really hard thing to negotiate. I also negotiate for my district, and I just don't know if they'd buy it. But I mean, we've also talked about like, I know a speech pathologist who works over in Washington now. She left Billings Public Schools and she's over in Washington. And so as far as caseload, like you guys were talking about last session, they pay once you hit a certain level. If they don't hire another speech therapist, special ed teachers and speech therapists, everybody, they get paid like an extra 0.5 FTE. And so that's something that would either have to be budgeted for, or they would have to figure out how they're going to find, I mean, but with a huge shortage of both speech pathologists and, I mean, school psychs are in a shortage too. We're all in a shortage, and that's the hard part. So I think that there's a lot of ideas out there and ways that it could be negotiated, because I know you've also talked so much about local control, but I think that the other part is, where does the money come from? And if the money's not there, and specifically, earmarked for special education, or like Tamara, I know that you're gifted and talented. And so if it's not earmarked for those purposes so that we can acknowledge there's more students and they're coming out of the seams right now for us in special education. And so how do we, number one, know what a caseload should look like? And I think that's what a good survey could do. And this is work that I was hoping to do a little bit of through my state association, but it's actually every time I go to it, I'm like, special ed needs this just as much as speech therapists, with the caseload and how much can people actually handle. And now with all the discussion about the behavior, I mean, I work at Target Range, so it's like a rural school where our total population is 523, and we are kindergarten through 8th grade there. And our kindergarten through, well, she was up to 4th grade this year, I guess. 3rd grade, I'm sorry. And she had a few kids where she couldn't even be in her classroom because she spent the entire day dealing with these few kids, bouncing from one kid to the next kid and taking them to the office and sitting with them and trying to make sure that, they're getting the proper treatment based on their IEP and their disability. And I just think, like, thank goodness we have really great paras who are running the classroom, but there's like nobody in the classroom then. And so the real question is, like, how many of these kind of kids, and there's more and more, does it take, and who's running special ed when these behavior kids are going off like that? And I think that that's a really something that I'm hearing from so many, like, teachers are like, we can't have them in our classroom. They're not all in special ed, but a lot of them are. And I think that even just considering, in speech therapy, we talk about caseload is just a number, but really your workload, and having a way to weight people like with points. I know some schools do that for their CBA and say, you can have this many points for your caseload, and this is what it is. But once you hit this number of points, and they're weighted based on how hard they are they just a math kid that doesn't have any behavior problems, or are they like a really, really complicated kid, on a scale of 1 to 5? And so once you hit so many points on your caseload, that's when you need extra people, or that's when you hit the next FTE level. Because the work that you're doing, because of the stress that you guys talked about last time, not just with litigation, but those parents are often involved in the litigation, and they have the advocates, and making sure that we're doing things within their kids' rights under the special education system. So I think that you've had a lot of great discussions about that. And I think that we as a state have to start looking this direction. And so I don't know how many groups it involves, or if it can make it to the legislature, but I think that having a really good solid survey like you're proposing is a really good first step. And I think that I hope that all of us can come together to work on it, OPI and, my association, and just like getting where we can to help everyone working in schools, because we will not be able to retain people at the rate that we're going. You just can't expect, like, I see a very seasoned special ed teacher in the woman I work with, and she's just like, I can't go back next year, but then 2 weeks into summer, she's like, okay, I heard this kid's leaving, maybe I can do it. And I don't know how we retain these people without some of these measures in place, but I think it all has to start with data. So the survey idea is really important, I think. And Tamara, I'm so glad that you're part of this too, because I think that making sure that our gifted and talented kids are represented in getting that kind of information as far as special services altogether are concerned is just important. So
Thank you. Well, and you mentioned, like, I had a 2nd grader this year who was self-contained in a room with a para every day, half day every day, because of basically he's a twice identified kid.
mhm.
But some of those kids that you're talking about may also have giftedness as part of the package.
For sure.
And in schools who don't have someone in my position to recognize that part about that student and to be a part of that team for what to do for them, that piece is missing for kids in a lot of schools.
Mm.
Yeah.
I know, just, it's something that I'll be paying attention to, but because obviously there's some of this stuff like starts to tie into other committees or other agencies, and I think some of the behavioral things also tie to some of the mental health issues that we're experiencing more in schools. So I do know one of the committees, there was a bill last session, it's a behavioral health, I'm forgetting the whole name of the bill. But they specifically were looking at like a lot of mental health supports, and they're presenting a report next week, I believe. The report's already out there, but one of the suggestions in the report was funding to schools for like health, but specifically for like mental health. So it's just interesting how those things tie together. But that just made me think of it with, like you said, there's behavioral issues, not just with students who are identified, who have IEPs, but we're hearing across the board, like behavioral issues and not having the resources to address those behavioral issues. Some issues raised in rural schools is they may not even have a space to put that student or separate that student, a safe spot where they can do that. So I think all those things tie together.
Yeah, we're a small school, we're not rural, but we've been in that situation. And so far it's been the poor ladies up at the office who are dealing with those kids all day long, or one para who has to go in our second little conference room. Next year, our administrators actually retained a teacher who wasn't otherwise going to have a job, and said, who worked as a special educator helper this year. And so his job next year is to have a room where those kids who are suspended or who are not safe in the classroom are going. And his job, and I wouldn't want that job, is to try and get work out of those kids. But it's going to be like all different levels. So that's a hard job. So I'm thankful he said yes. I'm interested to see how it goes.
And I know we've talked about some of the ways that we can try to support teachers with some of the behavioral challenges they have to face in the classroom. Obviously, a lot of it has to do with just like more money going to them, going to the schools, going to the resources. But there are any other ideas or build upon that or build out any of that of how we can make sure schools have the support to deal with the behavioral issues that are affecting all the students, right? So they're affecting the gifted and talented students, that attention has to be taken away from them, and they're just affecting the everyday classroom. The teacher has to spend all that time on that one student. It's affecting everyone else. So what are other ways we could try to, I guess, assist schools, assist teachers in that?
I guess one of my questions, and really I'm like guarded against, online stuff for kids nowadays, wondering if that contributes to behavioral issues. But is there some technology that would help with that could be that could be provided to the schools to assist with that?
Well, if we're talking about I don't know why I just thought of this. This is probably completely off the wall. So you guys can tell me this is very silly. There are schools that are looking at like banning cell phones, right? Because of that technology thing and the bullying that's done like virtually, right? While you're sitting in the classroom. But then there's other concerns that come along with that. One thing I just thought of, and I don't know if this would be plausible, but ever seen when they do it in concerts or comedy shows where you have to actually put your cell phone in a bag? And the bag is, it can't like record or whatever, but you can still have it on you. But it's basically like stopping it from recording or picking anything up or doing anything I forget what it's called. But they have them at concerts. So people actually can keep their phones on them, but can't use them. So
I just finished reading the book, The Anxious Generation, because a whole bunch of other people at my school were reading it. And it does talk about that, about banning cell phones and things like that, and just helping with the behavior. I think they said that the incidence of behavior went down dramatically with cell phones being put in those little pockets, because you're not going to stop parents from sending them to school. But
and I get when parents, like some parents don't want, they're like, what is it? If there's an emergency, I want my kid to reach. It's hard to argue against that, but there might be Okay, so there, that is being used already. I wasn't sure if that was being used at all, but
Yeah,
it's an
there's
idea.
Yeah, there's data in that book, which I listen to it on Audible, so I have to go
Ooh.
listen or look at the data that comes on the website that goes along with that book. But that whole book is just eye-opening, and I feel like it should be like required for every school board in Montana to read that book.
Yeah.
That's
I,
something we really haven't gotten a lot into in any of our groups is the impact of like technology, of AI, of all of that on our schools and on our students. And while we may not see how that interacts with like budgeting and funding just yet, um, I bet it will a lot more than we can foresee right now.
Yeah.
yeah, my son-in-law is a teacher of 7th and 8th grade science, and he is the only one at the school using the technology that allows him to track every school computer in the classroom to see that the kids are really doing the work that they're supposed to be doing. And he's held a couple of trainings for the other teachers at the school so that because he thought maybe they weren't using it because they couldn't figure it out or didn't want to take the time. But he said a lot of them are kind of in denial of like, oh no, I know these kids are looking at my work, what they're supposed to be looking at. And he said, are you telling me that what you didn't like figure out those quick screensaver things to switch back and forth on screens when you were a child? And I just think there's a lot more monitoring that should be going on with the technology as much as it can assist with education for sure, but it needs to be monitored. So
I know there's a lot of pressure put on education entities and teachers about like data collection. There's always another federal state requirement being like, we need to collect another data point from you. And how do we collect that? But I think it will be interesting to see how we can build in like technology and AI. And I know there's ways that they're doing upgrades to systems as we speak to try to make all the data collection smoother and easier. But it's interesting to think how possibly as we build that stuff in AI or whatever, that teachers may have more time. And I know a lot of that, I feel like in the last 10 years, a lot of time has been taken up by reporting. And I wonder, hopefully we're on that curve where we can start to embed some of that technology. So we curve it back down where teachers start getting back more of that time and less of the reporting time. I think there's ways the technology is there. How we implement it into education, we'll just see. And we're obviously cautious about it because it's our kids. And we've seen the downsides of technology too.
yeah, for sure. I know that North Carolina is banning cell phones in the classroom this coming
As a
year.
state,
Sorry,
like
as a
statewide.
state. Yeah,
Wow, that would be awesome.
I believe as a state. Now that I say that, I'm pretty sure it's as a state. Yes.
And in Montana, we do have a lot more local controls. So some of that cell phone stuff might be a little bit tougher to do on a state level. But if you're talking about possibly using those bags,
Yeah.
pilot grant program to allow schools to use that bags to see if it improves outcomes, that's something that the state can be involved in, right? So here's a little seed money. Let's see if this works. Let's see if the kids, if there's a reduction in bullying, if there's an increase in test scores, then maybe other schools want to pick it up or consider it or use that grant program. So
Yeah.
that's where that you incentivize that stuff or at least try it out. So I went to the second page of the summary, so we're not just focusing on there. I know we've already hit on some of the inflation. We've hit on some of just like the cost of services. I know, Shelby, since you weren't here last time, I don't know, we started to talk about like some of the PT and OT stuff, but you are the expert. If there's anything you want to expand upon some of the stressors with that, I think it would be really beneficial.
The biggest stressor I think that is, well, and Sarah Novak hit on all of them, and I've had talks with Sarah, but just that the caseload size for speech pathology is really large. I don't know if it's really big for PT and OT. I assume OT also in larger districts, because we're seeing a lot more fine motor problems with kids who aren't getting any practice doing handwriting or cutting things because all they're doing is playing games. And so I think that there's more than that to OT. Obviously, it's a very large field, just like mine is. So I think that caseloads are probably really getting big. But you know, when people talked last meeting about the cost of people who are contracted with the schools and how that's not taken into consideration either, that's a huge thing for co-ops. And then, you know, the expense, the way that Medicaid's not reimbursed, because those of us who are medical professionals can get Medicaid reimbursement, which helps the special education funding for speech, OT, PT, and then a number of different services that are in the guide, but it's so little money. And it's just, I think the federal government's attempt to say, look, now we're doing this too, but it's just not that much. But I know that the rates are determined in state for some of those things. And so I think that looking at seeing if we can increase that Medicaid pool of money would be helpful too. I don't know, you guys have really hit a lot of things. It's really just so much caseload for speech therapists, because we're also case managers. We're not just related service providers, we're also case managers. So of the 63 kids on my caseload last time, I was the case manager for 23 of those. So, well, speech was, there's me and one other person, but it's just, it's a lot of extra work when you're the case manager, as everybody who's in special ed knows. So.
And I apologize, where were you working from again? I know you said that before, but
I'm
I have such a hard.
Target Range in Missoula, which is an independent district.
Okay.
So we're
So I
not
have
part
such
of
a, I've started to like remember where everyone's from, but I have a hard time keeping it straight.
I know, and I've not been at the last two meetings, so just listening.
Well, Tamara, we didn't touch too much on the gifted and talented stuff, and I know we've hit on it and we've kind of covered it, but is there anything that we haven't talked about gifted and talented that you think should be highlighted for the legislature?
Well, it's a mandate in our law and state accreditation standards, but there's not enough money provided for a school district to implement what is being asked of them. And there's not a lot of oversight on what is or isn't done. So a lot of schools will check a box and say, we have a gifted program, and basically what they're doing is saying we have AP classes, so therefore we're meeting the needs of those kids. When sure, that's an important thing to have in place for gifted and other advanced kids, but it's definitely not the be all end all and full spectrum of services that come when you have a gifted ed specialist who is providing more comprehensive services. That'd be like saying we're meeting the needs of special ed students with cognitive delay by simply providing differentiation in the classroom. And we know that that's not the be all end all of what they need. It's the same for the opposite end of the spectrum. There's so much more that we provide. So
that made me think of something. So for instance, for the Indian Education for All, for many years, it was kind of like a box checking exercise a little bit. You get this chunk of money. Are you doing Indian education? Yes, I am. In the past session, they actually increased some of the reporting requirements for that. And I'm not saying that one had teeth in it. So schools can actually lose money if they don't like show that they're teaching Indian education, but you could add reporting requirements Double-edged
Increasing
sword,
the
right?
reporting requirements would help.
Right.
Because when school districts see that come through, then they're like, oh, crap, I better do something about this.
Right.
Because they're actually checking. And so that would help. Yes. The amount of money that's available, like in my district, we get usually somewhere from $2,500 a year up to about $7,000 or $8,000 a year. In terms of, but I have to apply. So there's one pot. I have to apply for it as a grant. And how much I get depends on the size of my district and how many other people are applying. So if the same amount, it's $250,000 a year usually. If 100 schools apply, then you get a certain amount. If 1,000 schools apply, you obviously get less because, so it's partly dependent on how many people are applying as well. So that's another factor that we're dealing with.
And I think, don't you think the same could be said, and we don't have anybody represented from this group in here, but for our English language learners, you know, depending on the size of the school, what is being done there. And you know, one of my best friends is the English language learning person for Missoula County Public Schools, and he's just always getting more kids and not having more staff, you know, and he's like looking for rooms to work in, much like
Yes.
some special education teachers. And I think that that is also something that probably needs to be on the survey, you know, like how is funding handled for that? What's the caseload like for people who are working in ELL, and what how many kids do they have? How many languages do they need to speak? You know, like he came one day and I met him after work and he's like, I had to speak like 8 different languages today and I don't know a lot of them very well. And I think that that's a really stressful job too, with certain expectations, but not much funding specifically for that program. So I think that that's another one that needs to be probably included in this. All these
I
special.
have
And that has the tie-in, so there's Fed tie-in to that as well. But yeah, no, that you're right, that we haven't discussed too much. I think we've only mentioned it maybe in one other group was some needs for that. So that is something that, you know, we need to look into further. And it's also growing population. And I think it's also important to note a lot of times, like the data that we use for schools, right? It's like 2 years at a date. So sometimes you have that influx of students they may need English language services, and to be able to respond to that on a dime is really hard.
Katie, I have a question idea that kind of fits under a transparency umbrella.
Sure.
Partly based on my recent experience. So tiny bit of history, just in case I didn't say it before, or for people who didn't know. So my district's facing a budget shortfall due to inflation and all those other factors because of why we're all here today. One of the solutions was no art teacher at the middle school, eliminating a 3rd grade position and squishing the kids into fewer classes, and eliminating my position. So no GT program. And so that was one way that the district mitigated that shortfall. So my students and my parents and I said, hell no. And we raised $110,000 in a month and a half in order to save my position and obviously therefore the GT program. 3 weeks after the end of the school year, agenda comes out for a special school board meeting. And one of the items on the agenda is approval for resurfacing the track at a cost of $240,000. So how do we have $240,000 to resurface the track if we don't have money for a middle school art teacher, a GT teacher, and a 3rd grade teacher?
Right.
So it kind of brings the question to me, like when all of this money comes into the school districts from the state and the county, is it predetermined how much goes into each pot? Or is there somebody saying, oh, we need to put, this money in this pot? Like, how is it decided exactly which fund or budget all these different amounts of money goes into, and where's the transparency on how that decision is made and who's making that decision, and what factors they pull into to make those decisions.
So all the budget sheets that we put out as OPI puts out that details what money they're getting from the state going to which pot, and what money is coming in from the feds and everything like that. You can look up every single school district on OPI's website. Once it goes to the school, there can be some variances. And I wonder, and this may be something you want to ask, if that money for the track is coming from ESSER dollars. Because some of the ESSER dollars have to be spent by a certain amount of time, so you wouldn't be able to use them for salary purposes, but you could use them for something like redoing a track, which I know can be frustrating, but the state didn't determine how ESSER dollars could be spent or when they had to be spent by. That was the feds. So I would just be curious to know like what pot of money it came from, because if it was ESSER dollars, it might have been incentivized, like you have to spend it by this time, or you send it back to the state for the state to give it to another school. So I would be curious of just that for that instance, but I understand what you want for like transparency. I think that is really important. A lot of times these budget sheets, they are transparent, but can you understand them as a layperson? I look at some of them and I have a very hard time understanding them, and I have a lot more experience under my belt. So there is some transparency there, but it is hard to understand. But Tamara, I can send you a link so you can see like the budget sheets that we put out. Or
Great.
not we, I don't do it. You wouldn't want me to do it, but someone much
I knew what
smarter
you
than me
meant.
at OPI does it.
Yes, thank you.
But
Okay.
I guess, Katie, that makes me wonder, why aren't teachers sign contracts every year, right? And doesn't that commit the funding for them? And so why couldn't
There's
those?
sometimes
drop?
I'm speculating on this, I'm not sure, on that particular case, but there's deadlines for when the money has to be like allocated, and then there's a deadline for when the money actually has to be spent by.
Gotcha. Okay.
I don't know Tamara's circumstance, but I would find that concerning too, right? If I heard that. But then
Yeah.
what was in my head, I was like, I wonder if it was ESSER tied dollars and there was reasons why they made that decision. Not saying they could have made other decisions, but it's just something to ask if it came from the ESSER.
Yeah. Well, and it's kind of an example in general of
Yeah.
how it just kind of epitomizes the question that a lot of people have in general. Like, how do we have money for this and we don't have money for that?
I think that's when we have to talk about educating the community, and maybe not, I can't say every decision is made perfectly, but I do think that has to talk about like educating the community of what schools need, because someone could see the school repaving that track and then not want to vote for a levy because they don't understand maybe that funding for that came from something else, right? And they had to use it for that for whatever reason, but the levy is because we need to raise money for X, Y, and Z. And sometimes, like, I get it if you just see that, but you don't understand everything that happened behind, you may be like, nah, I'm not even gonna look at that levy. But that's when we talk about some of the community engagement, and I think community transparency is really important, because if that was something brought up in another group, that there is, whether there is or not, there's an image of fiscal mismanagement by some in the community of schools. And that may not be justified whatsoever, but there is that image there. So what do we do to address that image? What do we do to break down those walls, to have that transparency, to have those conversations so people feel like their taxpayer dollars are being used wisely, and it's also being used the way that we get the most benefit for our students. So it's definitely something we can look into. But we should talk more, Tamara, about the transparency. Maybe you could take a look at what I sent you and see like what pieces are missing that you would like to see, because transparency, I think, is huge.
Sounds great. And I agree. Thank you.
So we're wrapping close on our time, and I know we've started to dabble into the survey questions, and it sounds like you guys are really interested in trying to build out survey questions. So I would love just like email them to me. I think that'll work best if you like just email some ideas or what you want covered and some questions. Again, I'm using our conversation. I'm not going to be able to hit on everything in a survey, so I'll just put that out there now. I won't be perfect, but the reason why I'm talking to you guys is I want to make it the most useful survey for legislators, for organizations, and for the public in general. So just as you're thinking, I would like to send the survey out by like the first week of August. So just over like the next 2 weeks, if you have any thoughts on what should be covered in the survey, shoot me an email.
So we're
And-
looking for questions to give them about
So
their
one
thoughts
of
and perceptions about school funding or seeking
So one of the
ideas
things-
or
I am open to, I know that's not the question, but I'm open to trying to collect the most data I think will be useful for the legislature. So some of the things I'm looking at is for teacher retention, what is your top concern regarding teacher retention? So then it could be pay, work environment, behavioral issues with students. And I haven't flushed, the problem is sometimes there's too many things to list, so it's narrowing it down. But looking at like kind of what is your biggest concern with special education and list out kind of those like, that's a little broad. But along those lines, trying to identify like what are people's number one priority? What are the things that need to be addressed right away? What is the overall like tenor on some of these issues or concerns? And the reason why I'm asking you, I want to bring to light some areas that haven't been brought to light as much as possible. So that's why I'm asking you guys. Is that helpful with what I just said, or was it too broad still? Well, thank you all for joining me tonight. We'll wrap up like 3 minutes early. But like I said, stay in contact with me. All the stuff is, I try to put as much online so you have access to everything and can access everyone that everyone has access to. But if for some reason you can't find something, shoot me a note. I'll track it down for you. Keep questions on your mind for the survey. And then the other thing is I will send out probably midway through August an update on the white paper, hopefully like a skeleton kind of draft for people to give some input on as well. So, but if you guys want updates on anything that we're working on, just shoot me a note. But that I'll continue to update as that is going along to continue to get feedback from that as well.
Great. And will the your site remain open kind of indefinitely at this point, or?
Yep.
Okay.
I
Great.
can't promise after January.
Yeah.
Because it's a different superintendent. But all of this it is technically archived because it is from the government. So it will be archived. So everything I put up on the website and everything will be archived. So it will be available in some form.
Okay. Great.
and you'll be sharing those draft versions with us or
So these summary drafts are on the website and in the share drive already. So what I have shared on the screen, those are up on the website. They were links in the emails and everything. And then the white paper draft, I'm hoping to have up a draft for people to review, see what's missing, what we can build out by mid-August. So then we can get the legislature finalized white paper in September with tons and tons of time for them to review for the 2025 session.
will you be emailing us when those white paper drafts are up?
Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Can I just say one thing really quick, Catherine? To
Yeah.
add to the discussion about 3 to 5-year-olds, I'm not sure how many legislators, so I want to make sure this gets into the white
Mhm.
paper. I don't know if they realize that we are required providers for Part B. So once kids turn 3, we have to help them if they qualify for services in the schools. And like, I just know that I was in a meeting in the Hellgate, special ed director said that they usually have about 9, and this year they had 30. And so just that population is exploding all over the place. And so I think it's just really important that they know that we don't have the option to say, oh, we're just not going to serve preschool kids. Like, we need funding for that in a big way because the numbers are just off the chart. So I think that's a really, really important part. And I forgot to say that earlier. So
No, I agree. And It's definitely on May's summary.
Yeah,
Yep,
I was
go
just
ahead.
looking in the May one and it doesn't say that we're required providers. So I mean, just in a white
That's
paper.
a
I
good
feel
thing
like
to it. Yep,
important for them to
that's
know.
exactly what I'm looking for. So when I put the white paper out there, it's just like, okay, you covered that, but we really should highlight that they're required. There's not an option. So
Yeah.
but that's exactly what I'll be looking for. So if you see things like that, if you guys review these summary pages, the summary pages are very rough. I just thought it was something beneficial for me and then hopefully for other people too.
I think they're really good summaries.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay. Well,
Thank
thank
you,
you again
Katie.
for everyone for joining tonight. My door's always open, so shoot me an email or whatever. I look forward to keeping in contact. But enjoy the rest of your night.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.